Thank you for having me here today. I'm hoping that today what we'll do is we'll spend a little time in the beginning just hearing a little bit about how I came into this work and kind of stumbled upon it in kind of an arena that isn't very saturated with people who are doing similar work, although there are people out there doing very similar things that I've stumbled upon. So you'll hear a little bit about how I came into this work growing up and where I am today, as well as the nature of the work that I do out in the field. And then we'll close out with a little opportunity for you to see it in action and also play around with me. So we'll have a little fun later on in our time together. So I want to begin by introducing myself. My name is Taryl. I always start with, hi, my name is Taryl, and I am an incessant drawer. How many of you out there cannot seem to stop doodling, drawing, sketching, noting, right? That's probably why you're sitting here today, is that something compelled you to be in this class where you were learning about how it is that we can utilize the creative part of us, the part that's dying to express something, right? The part that's dying to put something out into the world, not just as a way of doing, but as a way of being. Well, I was that kid. When I was in school, I was the hoarder of all of the materials in the first grade classroom. I was the one that had a desk filled with a stash of scissors and notebook paper and markers, primarily because I just never bothered to put any of them back. I just collected more because the more I had in my desk, the more I felt at home in my very own school setting. So I was that kid that everything seemed to come at me so quickly and so rapidly in school that I had to draw. I wasn't one of those kids who just liked to draw. I needed to draw. I needed to draw to make sense of the world. I needed to draw to hold on to ideas and things that were coming at me so quickly that I felt like I was compensating for my lack of intelligence growing up rather than enhancing it by adding drawing into my world. So along with my hidden kind of talent for drawing as a kid, I also felt like that my teachers didn't understand me. For the longest time, I felt like my teachers felt like that when I was drawing, I was escaping from the world rather than engaging in it. And so I was the kid who was constantly asked to put away her pens and put away her notebooks and put away all the things that for me were tools for learning. They weren't just things that I wanted to do, they were things that I had to do. Now, add to this that my parents were both pillars of the institution. My mother was a third grade teacher that retired after 36 years of being in the same third grade classroom, room 207, in Washington School District in Phoenix, Arizona. My father, when he retired after 38 years of teaching middle school, they named the gymnasium after him. That's the kind of legacy he was in Paradise Valley school systems. Now, add to that my parents and everybody in my household were educators. You would think that their offspring, someone like me, would be good in school, wouldn't you? But I wasn't. I struggled to get by. I struggled to get through. I didn't like school. I didn't engage in school well, but I did what I had to do because it had to look good at all times. Now, why does that matter for me right now? Well, because I started out much like everyone else. I started out with stick figures. I started out with the wiggly hair, the scroggly legs, the incongruent. Nothing about what I did when I was younger really was all that incredible or amazing, but it's where we all start. It's also where sometimes it ends. It's only as adults that we start to convince ourselves we can't draw. How many of you, if I were to hand you a piece of paper right now and say, draw a picture, would be a little apprehensive to share it with the room? There's something about as we grow up that in schools, a lot of scholars even say that we have educated children out of being creative rather than being into creativity. That every year we put kids through traditional education and we tell them that drawing is just something that's a gift given to some, those creative types, and not given to others. We educate them out of feeling like they can draw. I haven't met a single adult that when I show them what I do, don't say, oh my gosh, I don't know how you do that because I can't draw worth a lick. You heard people say that? Have you said it yourself? Something in our upbringing has told us that if we don't put something out in the world that is of perfection, it's not worth anything. And that's how I grew up. I grew up feeling like that was inadequate. Long before that ever existed, long before computers ever existed, I came from an era where that was my norm. I had little rub-off letters. I don't know if you remember those. They still make them, by the way. You sell them at the craft stores. You know, the little popsicle stick, and you rub off all the little decals or the letters. That's what I used with most of my visuals. I used computers that still had holes on the side. I had the label maker that had no font selections or size selections. I remember typewriters. I remember correction fluid. It didn't matter what I was brought up on. This was what I remember, and this is what I used to bring things into the world that were visual. And what most people thought was, oh, isn't that nice? Isn't that cute? She's the poster queen. This is what I used. It's what I preferred because I hated note-taking. I hated outlining. I hated anything that was linear. I only wanted to draw in the margins because if I could draw in the margins and make connections, then I could stay under the radar and my teachers wouldn't have to know that I was doodling because it looked like I was doing what everybody else was doing. And then I fell in love with that. Long before the commercials of Live Out Loud, I just hailed to the Sharpie Corporation because this is where I fell in love with art again. Because I was tagging literally everything, things probably I wasn't supposed to be tagging, but that Sharpie was hitting absolutely everything around me because with it, I could draw and start to live the way that I always wanted to live out loud for others to see. But I still wasn't sure that what I was doing was going to be seen as intellectual, but instead as a compensation. And so, now today, this is what my tools look like. Today, I'm using markers, I'm using chalks, I'm using erasers, I'm using anything that I can get my hands on because now, in my company today called Frame the Message Inc., I am drawing on large-scale 3x5 panels of this size, sometimes that span the room. They're sometimes 15, 25 feet in length, and they are large-scale drawings that help people in spaces as they're learning to connect with content the way that I did when I was a kid. Now, what was it that took me from the kid who's hiding everything under her desk because she thought people were going to think she was stupid or that she couldn't keep up or that she was distracting herself from her own learning or disengaging? What brought me from that to that? This was my experience growing up. The sad part about my upbringing in school was that I said that I barely scooted by, but for the most part, those were the grades I got. And no, it wasn't because my parents taught at the school or I had any in, but primarily because I have graded sheets that look a little like this. My content was poor, my grammar was inadequate, I was a little off topic, but I would always do the extra credit audiovisual assignment, and because I would do that, that's the grade I would get. Now, what's really kind of sad about that is that that sent me a very subtle message. What my teachers thought is that it would encourage me and it would motivate me because they knew I had it in me, but I wasn't always demonstrating it the way that the other kids were demonstrating it. But on the contrary, unfortunately what it did is it sent me a message that it's okay to lack content as long as it looks good on the outside, then you can get by in life. And that's what I did. I skated through junior high and high school all the way up until I went into college where I really thought I need to do something that involves art, otherwise I'm sure I'll never get by. I did what I had to do to get by, but this was always what I felt, is that as long as I make it pretty, nobody will know. Nobody will notice. Nobody will care. Well, I couldn't be further from the truth, because when I found out that I had in me an intravenous draw to become a teacher, that's what I decided to do when I got out of high school. Despite every effort to stay out of education because my family were all so wrapped up in it, I couldn't resist the temptation to become a teacher. And when I did, it's when I learned my best message. My best message came from my 3rd and 4th grade students. Because what I found was, when I started I opened the doors to my very first 3rd grade classroom, and I had bulletin boards that spanned all 4 walls, well before the fire marshal came along and said that now we can't hang that much stuff up in the walls anymore because it's a fire hazard. I literally had things dripping from the ceilings and dripping from the walls, but you know what? That wasn't teaching. My life-size Minutemen and my 3-dimensional habitats, that wasn't teaching. What was really teaching was when my students came to me and said, now if you've ever worked with kids, you know that they're pretty self-destructive, right? They never think anything they do is good enough. They'll scribble on a piece of paper and they'll crumple it up and they'll throw it away. And when you ask them, what were you doing? That was perfect. It was great. Why would you throw that away? No, I didn't like it. And they start over. No matter how many trees you tell them they're killing by throwing away that many pieces of paper, they still say, I don't like it. It's not good. They were self-destructive. And what I had to do is I had to model in my very own classroom that the minute I did that to myself and I said it wasn't good enough or I did something over, I took down a bulletin board, I was sending them the message that the only thing that matters in life is perfection. That's not the only thing that matters. If we really look at visuals as a way of learning and not just something we put out into the world, then I had to model that for my kids. So I was surprised when a kid said to me one day when I was drawing, and I'm like, oh, I'm not really getting that message across. He said to me, you know, mistakes are only opportunities. And I said, well, that's pretty profound for a third grader. Where did you hear that? Who taught you that? And he said, well, you did. And what I didn't know is that every time I went to the board and I was willing to scratch out something visual to help them understand something, and I was willing to not demean myself or degrade my ability to draw, and I was willing to just scratch it out in order to help them learn, what they saw in me was that I was willing to put something out there to help them to connect to content better. Think about it. When you're trying to explain something to someone and they don't get it, well, I'm not following you. I'm not really sure I know what you mean. I'm sure we're on the same page. What's the first thing you do? Grab a piece of paper, Post-it note, X's, lines, arrows, right? And suddenly, when you put something visual in front of them to connect to what you've just said, there's a heightened ability for them to understand. We do it naturally. Businesses out there in the world, no matter what they do in their marketing, no matter how many millions of dollars they spend on their advertising, they are using visual means in their meetings, in their supportive staff, in their presentations to other companies. They're using visuals, and you know what? Not every one of them is made on a computer or using Photoshop. Many of them are just the ways in which they use the archaic flip chart and the Sharpie marker. And so if it's good enough for them, then I had to be willing to say, I can step back and I can present visuals as a way of learning for others and not be so pent up on the fact that only I see the mistakes. They don't see the mistakes. My kids weren't seeing the mistakes. And it modeled for them and allowed them to tap into the inner artist that they had. And hopefully, they wouldn't live a life of shame. They would live a life of pride in their own artistic ability. So they taught me a big lesson that year. So after about 17 years in the classroom, I left to do professional development at an organization called the Arizona K-12 Center. We did professional development for teachers. So I finally developed a comfort in using my art in front of 9 and 10-year-olds. It wasn't so easy when I stepped in front of adults. You know, stadium seating, quiet crowd, looking over their glasses like you're going to teach me something here, right? And as I stood there, I felt really ill-equipped. I didn't have flip chart. I didn't have markers. I didn't have things to draw with. I didn't have the anchor charts on my wall to refer to. I felt like I had nothing there that I was so used to using to express myself. And so I started planning for presentations the only way I knew how, and that was to grab my trusty composition book and my Sharpie marker and plan the way that I'd always planned, but I had never had any intentions to show anybody any of that. So imagine when my boss calls me in, it all worked fine for a while. Nobody had to know how I was planning, because when I was looking at how all these bigwigs were doing it, they had PowerPoints that were created and generated with computers and software and run through Photoshop and Illustrator to make perfect, and I couldn't compete with that. I could make a PowerPoint, but it absolutely contradicted everything that I believed about the way people learned. Absolutely contradicted it. So I lived in these two kind of worlds. So imagine what happened. I was doing all right until my boss calls me into her office and said, so you have a presentation coming up. Tell me a little bit about what you're planning in this first presentation. And I knew I had my composition book, but there was no way I was going to show it to her. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to articulate my thinking or anything about what I'd been planning because I didn't have my drawings there anchoring me and supporting me. So I knew that I had no other choice because nothing was worse than sitting there not being able to say anything and feeling like I was not representing our organization well. And so I pulled out the composition book, and it was a mess. It was a mess. But suddenly, I was able to express what I was going to do in the presentation as I was using the drawings to walk through my thinking. And I thought, oh my gosh, my boss, I'd fought all these years to make sure that I protected my own self from my drawings, that I thought, what is my boss going to say? She's not going to think this is very professional. She's going to want me to run it through someone in tech that can make it prettier and do something a lot more professional with it. But instead, she didn't say that. She said, can you draw it bigger? And I said, draw it bigger. Yeah, draw this bigger. And she said, yeah, draw it bigger. Because what she saw that there is a possibility for people to make connections to this program in ways they had never seen before. And the way that I was able to articulate it with my drawings was a heck of a lot better than the way I was able to articulate it without it. And this is what I drew. Nothing special. Nothing special, although it had a new way of presenting information to people in ways they hadn't seen it before. And so that's when I began to evolve. I began to evolve from a self-doubter to an artist, to saying it's okay to say that what I put out into the world is not Bob Ross, and it's not going to be sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars in museums after I die, because that's not what my art was. My art was a learning tool for me and a potential learning tool for others. And so I began my evolution as a visual graphic recorder. I'd seen lots of other people out in the world doing something they were calling graphic recording. And if you Google it, you'll see that everybody has their own style, their own way of doing it. Nobody does it. There's no methodology that every single person who's out there doing this work is doing. Everybody has their own sense of style and preference. And so as I started studying them, and I started studying myself, I started to realize that none of this was about the pictures at all. I had never had an art lesson past 5th grade because in elementary school, you all are required to take art. But by the time you get into junior high, unless it's something that you're really selecting as an elective, and I had a lot of other things that I was more interested in at the time, I stopped taking art classes. And so I always feel like I am this person who's out there disguising myself as an artist because I have nothing over a 5th grade education when it comes to art. But as I started studying what other people were doing and using this as a tool, I started realizing it wasn't about the pictures at all. It was about the concepts behind the pictures. It was about the connections that the pictures made for people. So I started learning differently. I started reading differently. I started reading for big picture and then coming back and scanning for the details. And guess what? I was a horrible reader. My mother was a reading teacher, and I never really developed the love for reading because I thought I had to hold on to all of it, every chapter, every word. But I'm now learning to read at the ripe old age of, I'm learning to read differently. I'm reading for big ideas, and then I'm going back. And so as I started to learn differently, I started to portray my learning and demonstrate my learning to others differently, which enabled me to start thinking about the style of learner I was. So you are probably we're much better at brain science today than we ever were when I was in school. We understand how people learn differently today, because I'm willing to bet that you all know what type of learner you are. If I were to say, are you a kinesthetic, a visual, or an auditory learner, I'll bet you could probably make a stab at it. So let's see. How many of you think that you probably are a visual learner? That's your primary method. Nice and high. Look around. Okay. Large number of you. How many of you would say kinesthetic? And how many of you would say auditory? That absolutely matches the research. The research says that in excess of 80 to 85% of our population would indeed call themselves visual learners, followed closely by kinesthetic, and then followed up with auditory. So if we know that about people, have you ever wondered why so much is coming at us auditorily and at this huge rapid pace without a single visual to help support us? If we know that about our world and we know that about us, then why aren't we starting to display things to people in different ways, in ways they learn best? Visuals allowed me to do that. These visuals started to teach me about myself. I always thought I was a visual learner, but I found out I was more of a kinesthetic learner when I started to realize that the pictures I was drawing were actually processes. So I was learning how to coach, and in this coaching model, I had to remember 6 regions. And come on, who can't remember 6 regions, right? Well, remember, I struggled through school. So thinking about 6 regions and memorizing those was not going to come very easily for me. So what I did is I drew this picture. And in this picture, it had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 regions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. See, I wasn't good at math either. 5 regions that I had to memorize. Those 5 regions, all I had to remember was not just what they were, but what they meant for my coaching process. So when I coach, I don't memorize what those words say. I memorize what they stand for. I know that in the first region, I'm going to help them really figure out what's that goal, what's that post that they're trying to reach. When I'm imagining my coaching and I'm looking down that path, I'm imagining, well, what do you want to see when you get to the end of that? And then I'm imagining, what do you want to do to help you get there? And then I'm imagining, so what do you want to pay attention to in yourself when you arrive there? And then I'm remembering, so how has this conversation supported your thinking? See, I remember the concepts, I don't remember the words. So I started to realize that drawing can be as much about a process as it is a product. I don't see this picture in my head. I walk myself through that picture when I'm coaching. So if you know this about yourself, you know that it's not about the pictures, it's about the concepts. Knowing that that visual and kinesthetic learners make up the largest percentage of our population today, then it's not about if you use visuals, it's about when you use visuals. If you do not put visuals in the presentations that you provide people, you are missing out on a huge population of understanding. Even if it's a scratch or a doodle or a black line drawing or an icon or an X on the paper with a big arrow pointing one direction, it doesn't matter about the picture. It matters that the concepts are connecting for people. So then I found myself, for a kid who didn't do well in school, I actually ended up in a doctoral program. I got my master's degree in education, and then I went on to Arizona State University to get a doctoral degree in teacher leadership and innovation. And when I did, I started to let this part of me show. And you think it was scary to show it in front of my elementary school teachers or my boss. It was even more scary to show them in front of my instructors, my professors, people I respected and admired in educational literature. I was a bit frightened to show this part of me, but I decided to let it go because it was an innovative program, and if anywhere it was going to be accepted as a style of learning, then this would be it. So I started drawing pictures of how other people's dissertations and research started connecting for me, and these are what my notebooks look like. And to my surprise, not only was it accepted by these high-level scholars, not only was I able to bridge my creative expression, need for creative expression, with academic discourse, but it gave me the opportunity to start partnering and working with some of my professors at Arizona State University. And they started hiring me and bringing me on board to create visuals that would support their work. So one of my professors released a book on rethinking value-added models in education. And what her dilemma was is that she had done all this high-level statistic work, but the people that she needed to hear the message about why value-added models were not working in education, those were not the people that were going to read this book and understand this high-level statistics. They were the people that were doing the work in the field. And so she hired me to put together a little, just very impromptu kind of video that would help people understand why value-added models were bunk science. And so I pulled out anything that I knew, which just happened at this point in time to be PowerPoint. So in her book release, this is actually she is a renowned author, speaker, and expert in educational literature, one of the probably most esteemed professors in the College of Education at ASU, Dr. Audrey Beardsley. And this is what we put together to help people see why it didn't seem to matter what it was that people were doing, it didn't make sense. Now, I'm not sure the sound is going to work well, and we're not going to see the whole thing, but you're going to see how kind of archaic it is, but how simple the message is.
Right now, in almost every public school in America, our students' teachers are being evaluated, judged, and labeled based on what many have coined junk science. Value-added models, or VAMs for short, are statistical models designed to measure the amount of growth that students make on large-scale standardized tests to estimate how much of that growth and achievement can be attributed back to their student's teacher. While this method sounds promising and has been sold as such, there are several flaws that make the issue more complicated than it might seem. For example, many of the theoretical and methodological problems are often downplayed or ignored by those promoting VAM use. In response, this video presents the counter-argument to the pro-VAM narrative by focusing on the major statistical concerns of VAMs and the real-life consequences that accompany their use, especially when high-stakes tests are attached to VAM estimates. First of all, like all measurement tools, VAMs should be, but unfortunately are not always, reliable, valid, and free from bias. In fact, based on the most current research, a teacher classified as adding value has a 25 to 50% chance of being classified as subtracting value the following year, and vice versa. It would be just as reliable and a whole lot cheaper if administrators simply flipped a coin to determine whether a teacher was indeed effective in this regard. Related, VAMs should also be valid. Just as one would expect a scale to consistently measure weight, that is, with reliability, one should also expect a VAM to measure what it's actually supposed to measure, teacher effectiveness. While there is limited evidence to suggest that VAMs are valid, there are reasons for this, for example, surrounding the known problems with the tests upon which VAMs rely. We know that such tests are poor measures of student achievement, and we know that such tests were never intended to measure teacher quality or growth in student achievement from one year to the next that could be attributed back to teacher quality. But they are being used this way regardless. We also know that VAM estimates did not correlate or relate well with many other measures of teacher effectiveness. In fact, other measures sometimes flat out contradict VAM estimates and vice versa. This should not happen, but it does, and it does so too often. This and about 25 other issues are still making validity nearly impossible to achieve. Further, research evidence has shown that some teachers' scores are indeed biased by the students they teach, especially when they teach classrooms with disproportionate populations of gifted and/or high-need students. These are the students typically on the tails of the normal bell curve. This happens in many ways because students are not randomly assigned to classrooms or teachers. Regardless of what VAM statisticians in this area might say, their statistical controls too often do not work effectively to counter or control for this very real issue. All of these problems matter, but what matters more is the way in which these problems affect people. Despite mounting cautionary research, VAMs are being used for consequential decision-making purposes in many states across America. Teachers have been demoted, demoralized, and dismissed because of these models that are, at best, correct some of the time. To push human judgment out of these highly complex statistical equations, as others justify in their perpetual pursuit of objectivity, is scientifically wrong. If we are ever to truly find any value in value-added modeling, as still currently conceptualized and used, we still have a long, long way to go. If you are interested in reading more about the intended and unintended consequences of value-added models, I encourage you to read my book, Rethinking Value-Added Models in Education: Critical Perspectives on Test and Assessment-Based Accountability, available for purchase at Routledge.com and Amazon.com. All of my personal proceeds are going to the Akoto Orphanage in Siem Reap, Cambodia. I have absolutely no interest in making any money off of the many, many of which are shameful, consequences coming about as a result of inappropriately attaching high-stakes consequences to and/or making high-stakes decisions as based on VAMs, unlike others. Thank you.
So it goes on to describe why we're applying statistical means to evaluate teachers that don't make sense. Now, why does this matter? Because all across the country, teachers are being evaluated by this method. And this method is statistically proven to not work. So she's on a crusade. She's on a mission to make sure that people understand that. And they're not necessarily going to be the people that when they read her book are going to thoroughly understand the research behind it. So that's why she brought in visuals. How can we tell a story and bring the message to the people that need to hear it? That was not a very good sound quality, but it was actually her voice reading it. And so that was important to us to be able to hear from the person who had done all of the research behind it. So you can find a better version or a better quality version of that on YouTube. So what did I learn? I had to learn a lot about myself, but I also had to learn that if I was going to stand up and take something that I had been hiding for so long and I was going to stretch it out on this canvas to span the room, I was going to have to learn a few things about what this meant, because now I was about to take it public. That meant all of the little kind of scratches in my head that I was apologizing for all that time, I needed to get out of my head so that I could actually do what's important in this work, and that is listening. Because I don't want to draw just what I'm thinking, I want to draw what others are thinking. I had to learn to relax and breathe and give myself a stinking break. That everything that I saw in terms of mistakes or errors, or that's not what I saw in my head at all, I had to get that voice out of my head, because the minute I was self-scrutinizing my own work, guess what I wasn't doing? I wasn't listening. And I was holding on to my images and the pictures and not the concepts. So I had to learn to relax. I had to learn to listen differently. I can't capture everything that's being said in a 2-day conference. So I have to listen differently. I have to listen for themes instead of the little ideas. I have to listen for the big ideas. I have to be willing to ask questions. I have to be willing to bring in people in the audience and say, is that what you heard? And what else would you add? I had to find opportunities and get rid of looking at the mistakes. Whenever I made a mistake, it was amazing how many times a mistake would turn into an opportunity. I had to connect ideas differently, because the fact of the matter is that I had to stop apologizing for graphics as being something that wasn't of value in the scholarly world. That somewhere along the line we had learned that there are the creative types and then there are the intellects. And the creative types can't possibly be intellects too. Where we learned that, I don't know. But my favorite story comes from a woman who said to me, and if you really think that, it'd be nice to put in visuals, but I don't have to. A woman came to me at a conference once and she said, when you first set up there and I was getting all my notebooks out ready to listen to the keynote speaker, I said to myself, oh my gosh, this is going to be so distracting. There is no way that I'm going to be able to pay attention to what's being said and watch you at the same time. There's just no way. I'm going to have to just put on blinders and not pay attention. And she said, but what I found myself doing after a while is I'd just kind of be peeking up to see what you would draw. And she would be talking about, the keynote speaker would be talking about these big elaborate concepts like egocentrism and allocentrism and self-actualization. And she said, oh my gosh, you wouldn't draw anything. And I started worrying for you. Like, oh, I don't know how you're going to possibly draw something like that. And then she said, I started imagining, when you left it blank, I started imagining what I would draw. And then 5 or 10 minutes down the road, I'd look back and you'd drawn something to represent that. And she said, then I started comparing and contrasting what you drew with what I drew. And she said, I started to process the content so differently than if I had just written it in my notebook and never really gone back and visited 10 minutes down into the presentation. I started processing it at a deeper level. And I said, wow, that's really fascinating for someone who says they're not a visual learner. She said, I'm learning that you don't have to be a visual learner for visuals to be able to connect. And so that story reminded me that this is a strategy for learning. This isn't just something that's nice to add on, as the extra credit so you can get the grade. This isn't just something that you do to make your presentation more sparkly. It's a tool for learning. Because The fact of the matter is, it's about the message. Does this all send the same message? No matter if it's your stick figures to something a little bit more elaborate, none of these are scribbled drawings that all say the same thing. So as I began to develop over time, I started doing this as part of professional development. It was just something that enhanced the way that I brought messages to audiences of teachers. And then suddenly I got the opportunity to start thinking about beginning a business, because it was starting to become a really big facet of all of the presentations that I had been doing. And so I thought I'd learned a lot, but I never really knew how much there was still to learn until I built a website. How many of you have ever built a website? It's not easy, is it? And a lot of times it's not just building the website technically that's hard, it's the content you have to put in it, right? It's like, oh my gosh, how do I talk about myself? How do I tell people what I do? How do I help them see that this is something they need too? How do I talk about the worth of my organization or my business? It was going through that process that taught me a lot about who I was and what I did and why it was important. So FrameTheMessageInc.com was born. It was the hardest thing I ever had to launch because, again, it was like bringing out things from underneath my desk and was shaking hands, trying to tell people, yeah, this is good stuff. You should try learning this way. But when I launched it, I got an amazing response from people because people started coming up and saying, just like that woman did before, saying, you know what, I learned that way too. And you brought to me a whole new facet of understanding that I would have never gotten from my outlined notes in my spiral notebook or on my Evernote. You brought something new and something different to my learning. And so Frame the Message Inc., I fondly have just created an LLC and I'm working on an S-Corp so that I can begin to make this kind of a regular type of business for me. But it's amazing the opportunities that I've gotten. I've drawn for churches. I've drawn on sex, love, and dating. That woke you up. And I've drawn on teenage pregnancy and the apocalypse. I've drawn for organizations at an economic summit where all that was being presented were spreadsheets and economic developers and how that approach was affecting education. And I had to think outside of just drawing their spreadsheets and start thinking about metaphors and analogies and ways in which people might connect to some high-level abstract concepts. So I had to come up with why is this important? What makes this process a critical thing that organizations need to help to support people in learning? And this is what I came up with. It fosters divergent thinking. It's okay to think about one concept in 95 different ways. It's okay to start thinking about new insights that maybe weren't there before. Because when you can step back and you see something concrete in it, it makes it possible for us to manifest our own ideas and represent our own ideas as both individuals and as a group. And it illuminates one of those really most important things, and that is, what do you want to walk away with? How many of you walk away from conferences or speeches and you've got pages and pages of notes and they end up on a shelf and you never bring them back down again to review them? It's what you walk out the door remembering that matters. And if you want people to not just remember the very last thing you said, then this is a way to hold on to those salient points and give them a kinesthetic hook to hook their ideas to. What can they walk away with and be more focused and understand at deeper levels? So sometimes they tell stories. Sometimes they're narratives. Sometimes, most of the time, I have no idea where they're going to go. I don't know what they're going to talk about. I just draw as they're talking. In this particular one, you can see it started with this idea of a path and all of these things that start to distract us in our path. And then eventually what happens is the path, we get to the end of the path, and suddenly when the path ends, we don't know where to go from there. And so we self-destruct. We don't know what to do anymore. We try to figure out ways to get over this big chasm when our path is broken. And instead, what we need to do is we need to jump in. We need to jump in the water and stay together as we don't just disregard the path being there, but that we start to look at the path differently. And this is the ending of the story that I didn't know. until I started engaging with the audience, because I didn't want the path to go away, and I didn't want the water to overtake the path, because they both mattered. And so as I talked to people, they said somehow the path has to connect with the river. And this is what they came up with. The path became the surfboard, and the surfboard rode the wave into a hopeful tomorrow. And so sometimes what I do is try to involve the audience in what is that story that it's trying to tell, and how can we be reminded of those key principles. So, as I mentioned, 99% of the work that I do out in the field is on 3x5 panels, much like this one, in what I call live graphic recording. It literally is setting up a blank piece of butcher paper like that, and then just listening and drawing as they talk. At the end of the conference, generally they will use a flatbed scanner to scan it. They'll put it on their website, they'll share it digitally, they'll print it. Sometimes I've seen organizations use it and then zoom in on just key parts of it and then have some conversation about what they learned and how it connects with their learning. So that's 99% of the work that I do. Sometimes it's a lunch hour conversation. This one was in Tucson, where literally they were having lunch and I was off to the side eavesdropping on conversations. And it was Girl Scouts of America, it was Peter Senge, it was all of the businesses and organizations in that local community. And they wanted to have a conversation about what does it mean to be a healthy community. And so I drew in that hour, I drew what I heard. Sometimes it's visual note-taking. They ask me to keep notes in the course of a 2-day event. Sometimes it's getting people to envision something that they can't see. This is a group of teachers that was going to forecast the future. That meant they had to get themselves out of imagining what can't be and into something that might seemingly be impossible. And so this was allowing them to brainstorm those things. Using metaphors when it's high-level content. Because the fact of the matter is people just want to connect. They want to connect with others, they want to connect with ideas. In this particular one, it's a timeline, and the grant funders wanted to know that what they had planned in the grant, that the teachers saw connections in. So they're sticking sticky notes all over the places that they see connections to their own work. Sometimes it's just helping people understanding a process. It's a how-to, step-by-step guide. Sometimes it's a timeline. This was 25 years of an organization that grew into a tree. And as the tree grew, people in the audience started writing on birds and leaves when they came into the organization and putting them up on the timeline. So it was honoring 25 years of an organization. Sometimes it's a mission statement. Mission statements have a really good tendency to just disappear and dissipate in organizations because all it becomes is this little 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper on the office wall, bulletin board, 4 tacks, and then they say, organization, now go live this mission. So this particular organization hired me to come out and help them to draw their mission so that it could become the focus of every single staff meeting they had. Timelines. Mission statements. Sketchnoting. How many of you are familiar with sketchnoting? If you're following sketchnoting on Twitter, there are thousands and thousands of people out there that in their notebooks are no longer drawing outlines. Instead, they're drawing their notes. You will find a time that at some point in time you're going to be sitting next to someone that this is the way that they are capturing their notes. I decided that I had to get into the 21st century, so I started going digital. In the last probably 2 years, I've gone into using my Samsung Note Pro to try to use digital means to bring some of these images to life. So all of these are drawn right on my tablet. And these are just notes from conferences that I've been to. Sometimes people want to see kind of a trajectory of what does it mean to be a beginning teacher to becoming a master teacher. What are the key things they need to learn in each year? What's a framework that exists that I need to find myself in? Crowdsourcing. This was a hashtag that we used to crowdsource what it meant to rebrand teaching. And then when people wrote in their ideas, then I would draw them and then put their handle on each one of them. And then that became a kind of crowdsourced campaign. And then my favorite thing came along. iPhone finally created time lapse. Am I right? When they finally came out with time lapse, I started really thinking about how can I use inexpensive tools? Because quite frankly, organizations, and especially in education, cannot afford expensive tools. They can't afford to hire expensive videographers or artists or designers or web developers, and so they need inexpensive tools. So I started utilizing my iPhone, my iPad. I started using what I know. This happens to be a music video. That's all it is the album art and my tablet and the song written by this teacher. And so that was just an example of how we utilized Keynote and started using the tablet in order to create transitions that would enable him to teach his students. He was an English teacher, a high school English teacher, and he wanted to teach his students the lyrics to this poem, or to the song, through William Blake's poetry. So that's inexpensive tools that you can use, which I'm sure you're already probably using. So if you think you have to have a lot of money and a lot of expensive technology, you don't. So those are just some examples of how using inexpensive tools, not having any art training, just trying to use what you have and use it for good, understanding that it is a strategy for learning, but it's not the only strategy for learning, but it is probably one of the most underutilized tools for getting your communication and your point across. Underused, no doubt. Because my dad prides himself on quotes, and he gave me this one, and I thought he stole it from somebody. He actually said he made it up, but I think it says a lot. And that is, words are like lead pencils. The more you use them, the duller your point. We can overuse words abundantly to the demise and to almost losing our ability to communicate a message when so many words are inundating our world. We have to find ways to use visual means, in order to help that point be heard and connections to be made. No matter what that method is, visuals are one of those underutilized tools that I hope that you'll continue to find ways to use. So with that, that's how I came to be, who I am, what my company is about, and what I'm out there doing. Now I'd like to spend a little bit of time just giving you an opportunity to think about visuals and maybe play around with visuals just a little bit. Because if you were one of those that raised your hand that I said, okay, if I were to pass out a piece of paper and then I were to say, okay, you're going to share that visual with someone in the room, how many of you would be a little apprehensive? If you were one of those people, what I'm hoping that you're taking away from my message today is if we think about what is a visual is not necessarily this beautiful piece of art. It's not perfection, it's communication. It's not a picture, it's a concept. And it is a necessity in order to help people see your point. So this happens to be a blind man who somebody next to him is describing to him what she sees. And I thought it was a powerful photo that I just had to snap, because it reminded me of how important we think about people who don't need visuals because they're not visual learners. If this man can use visuals to learn and take in a concept, then so many people in our society could benefit from them as well. And so now I'd like to give you a chance to play around with some of those visuals. If you have any questions, I'd love to be able to answer some of those as well. You can find Frame the Message Inc. At framethemessageinc.com. You're welcome to email me or call if you have any questions about my company or about some of the prospects that you maybe see out in the field. I would love to learn from you as well, or even tools or technology that you find helpful that would be good for me to know. But I think I'll start with maybe answering any questions. I'm going to have Susan come around and bring some paper. So grab something to draw with, and we'll play a little bit. So while she's doing that, does anybody have any questions about visuals, about my company, or maybe even some exciting things that you've seen done out in the field that might resemble some of this? Questions or comments? I encourage you.
Did you color as you went, kind of thing?
When?
Because I don't know, to me it looks like it has a lot of detail in your drawings. even though I know they just what you thought, but did you like draw it out and then color it, or did you do color as you were going?
That's a good question. So what I usually do is I start with, so I mentioned that I use 2 different kinds of materials, actually more like 3, maybe even 4. So I always have a pencil with me because, to be quite honest with you, sometimes when they're really, really abstract concepts or I know that to draw it is not going to be nearly as good in an iconic kind of view. So I use a pencil for things that I think are going to be a little more complex. I also use a pencil first. Sometimes if I know that I want something to connect over here, but I'm not exactly sure where they're going because I mentioned I don't have their outline ahead of time. I don't know what they're going to say. So I have to kind of be prepared for anything goes. So sometimes if I have an idea that I think might connect, I'll kind of sketch it over here in pencil and then go back. And then that way, if it doesn't go that direction, I grab the biggest eraser I can possibly find and I can erase it and nobody really knows that that idea was there. Or maybe I draw it because I want to remember it later. But for the most part, everything is drawn as I go. Now, I think your question was, do you color as you go as well? It's impossible to kind of, especially some people that are really fast. I usually do everything in a black Sharpie first, and then I'll go back in color when I have time. And usually that time is when, I always like to think of a mental placeholder. So sometimes, and remember how I mentioned that lady said to me that I wouldn't draw something and then I came back to it? A lot of times I'll think about it, like I know what it's going to go here, and I'll start it, and then I'll have to catch up with what somebody else is saying, and then I'll come back and I'll finish it later. But I start it as a mental placeholder so I remember it. And then when I'm just listening to things that are filling in the blanks and they're more of the details rather than the big picture, that's when I'll color. So I'll color during that time while I'm listening.
I like this method for when I took my biology class for human anatomy, I draw it out as we went, so I draw the body and then I kind of pointed it out. So.
Yeah. I really think that pictures are mental placeholders. This is why it's so sad to me that there are so many kids out there that are drawing during class that are being told not to. So many kids. And for many kids, that is the way they hold on to concepts. And so I absolutely think this is the only way that I can ever capture content. And a lot of times I don't do a lot of detail on something simply because it's not the salient point. It's not the most important thing. And that's where I've had to step back and say it's okay to put something that's mediocre or unfinished because it doesn't matter. They get what it is. I was that detail person that wanted to go back and put the buckle on their shoes and the buttons on their shirt, and it never mattered. There's so much going on in that they're not paying attention to the buttons that I've missed. So I had to let some of those details subside. Other questions?
How do you keep up with the speed of it all?
It's hard. That's the listening differently. It's the recognizing. See, what I used to think was a lack of intelligence because I couldn't hold on to everything that my teachers were saying. I always thought, oh my gosh, I must not be as smart as everybody else in the room because how did they even catch that? I love Twitter. I love Twitter because I can look at other people's tweets during a conference and they'll tweet something that is right over my head. I didn't even hear them say that. But I love it because all those little details will be there for me when I need them. But when it comes to listening for this, it's like I give myself permission to not get it all. It's kind of like, I like to look at these pictures as being tweets. What do you decide? How do you decide what to tweet and not to tweet? You can't tweet it all. You tweet the things that kind of stick out for you, right? Or you consolidate ideas. When you do bullet points on a PowerPoint, how do you decide what to bullet point? They're just the big kind of themes or ideas. So I just started learning to let the details subside. If they're important enough, guess what? They'll come back. Sometimes I'll draw, and I'll think, oh, that's kind of important, but if I have time, I'll include it. Then I'll go on and I'll keep drawing, and it'll keep coming back. When it keeps coming back, guess what? It's no longer a detail. Now it's a salient point. So I can come back and I'll draw it in the place where I remembered it. I remember this is when we first started talking about it, which is what's cool for learners, is that then they don't just see it in the linear fashion of when it came up, they see it in the context of when it was first brought up, which really makes a powerful connection for people. Other questions? So you might have questions as we play. What do you want to know about what I do? The first thing that I do that you will not be able to do because you don't have are these chalks. What I learned is I could go through thousands and thousands of dollars if I were to color this whole thing in marker. So when I was in the classroom and I wanted to draw really, really big, I wasn't going to sit there and color. So I started using chalks because chalks can take up a lot more space and put a lot more color on the canvas. I can use blending. And it doesn't take me long to do. And it makes a really big mess, but it makes really great banner effects. And I love that I don't have to be neat and clean about it, because what I'm going to come back and do is I'm going to use my trusty Sharpie marker to give it structure. I'm going to, use one. And I always have backup pens because I go through them, like I said, a lot. And then what I can do is I can add texture to it so that it doesn't really matter if it's falling off the page. I can draw things in between. Like a frame. And none of that or what I really love about using chalks is that I've got this lovely eraser. See how sloppy that is? And I can get rid of it. So I can do, if I'm doing really big things, then chalks are the way to go when it comes to that. I can also back shade it so I can put the shadows behind, or the chalk behind it. Then the other thing I love is just everything that I'm going to do is now with Sharpie marker, and we can go back in and color it if we want. The other thing I like to do is add just a gray marker. And the gray marker just gives a little bit of shading. See how much more it pops off the page when you do? And that's just a shaded gray marker. All right. So, what are some of the main things that you find yourself wanting to or needing to draw when you're communicating a message? So think about the last time that you needed to draw a visual image. What were some of the images you had to draw? Arrows? You ever need to draw arrows? Okay, so an arrow, let's draw a straight arrow. Two parallel lines, think geometry. Two perpendicular lines, one on the top and the bottom. Midpoint. Connect, and then have fun. All right, draw an arrow. Then, if you want to make it even more fun, give it some dimension. So draw a series of arrows. Not all arrows go straight though, right? Sometimes arrows are curved. So think about your parallel lines now having the same kind of distance apart. And do the same thing, two perpendicular lines, center point. What are some of the other things that you'd have to draw besides arrows? Say again? What else?
Oh, like
Oh, connections. Okay, so what do you think about when you think about things connecting? What kind of metaphor would you use?
Like hooks or something?
Hooks. Okay, so kind of like hooks on a... Like a chain? Okay, so a chain. And you know what, you don't even have to, if you're one that likes dimension like I do, I'll show you another trick. But if you make it three-dimensional, then you can hardly tell where the overlap of the chain is. If you have a narrow in the back and a fatter in the front, then when you go to do your next one, you can't really tell. You can make chains, or if you're just more comfortable. Again, this is one of those things that nobody is paying a bit of attention to how accurate. My daughter's boyfriend is an amazing artist, and I'm frequently intimidated by him. Really frequently intimidated by him. And every time we draw together and he's always like, you know what, I wish I could give myself permission to be imperfect with things. Because it's almost more paralyzing when I'm so perfect about it that it doesn't allow me to communicate. I mean, I'll spend hours and hours and hours on one small detail of it. So giving yourself permission to, because you know what it is. It's about the concept, not the picture. Anything else? What about people? You ever have to draw people? Yeah? Hands. Okay. Here's my favorite way to do a hand. And I'm not even joking. I've done holding, like, usually I'm standing here going like this, and I'm drawing this, or I'm holding it this and drawing it this way. I've done holding up the earth, holding up people, but it's the concept, not the picture, right? Nothing that a little shading won't make amazing. There we go. Whoop, see, that's why I have an eraser. So hands. Oh, and here's the easy way. The hands always are doing something, right? They're either doing the sun devil, or they're doing so let's do a point, like a finger pointing up. Here's a really fast, easy way to do that. Start with your thumb. And then your pointed finger. And then you're going to do the three fingers coming down. So it's literally just three, like hot dog shapes. 2 and 3, and then down. So then you can do all kinds of things up here. You can kind of do the same thing with a thumbs up, like a like symbol. Right? I mean, it's about, and when you're drawing fast, you let proportion go, and this is why I love my shaded gray. Because there's just something about putting a little gray mark on here that just helps it pop. I'm going to do a couple people real quick. Running out of time. So really, honestly, people are, you don't have time for a lot of detail when you're drawing quickly. So all you need are just the main parts, right? So I typically start with wherever I want their hands and their body to be. In this particular case, they're going to be cheering, yay! And just give them a nice little triangle bottom and 2 feet, and then you got a person. And you just need a little shading. I find that everywhere I go, they want you to make sure that it's multicultural. That's really important to people. And so that's something that if you are using color, you should always, always, always consider. Sometimes I don't even get to the full coloring when you're asking about coloring. Sometimes it just ends up looking like that, and that's okay. You want people around them. Just kind of make them around sitting next to them. Sometimes just even doing this portrays the same message. I just kind of have learned to just do things quickly because, again, it's really just about the message. And sometimes shading or just putting in color just makes it, it's just, the eye knows what it is. If you've ever seen optical illusions where they just flash something up that's not even completed and then they take it down, 100% every time the brain knows what it was. Even when it was just kind of an outline or dots, the brain makes sense of it. So we have only about 5 minutes left, so I don't want to take up too much time on this, but I would encourage you, I really would encourage you to, and I'm hoping that by doing this like this and just showing you how really literally it's just something you're flashing up, that you don't need to perseverate on it, you don't need to put so much detail or thought. If you do have the time, I could go back and add details into these things as I'm listening. So it's always nice just to have a final product that at the end is something that they would be proud of or something they'd want to put up on their boardroom wall. Or so I typically try to give it as much attention and love as I possibly can. But when it comes to using it as a learning tool, it's really just about giving that kinesthetic and visual hook to people to help them to kind of see content differently. So are there any other questions that you have for me? And I hope that you'll continue to play and look up things online. I Google things all the time for ideas. When I really am getting tired of the same cliche metaphors over and over and over again, I Google something just to kind of give me some inspiration and something different. I practice really basic black line drawings of things that I find myself spending too much time on detail trying to figure out when I'm doing it live. So keep a journal, keep a notebook, and don't be afraid to live your life in the margins like I have. So thank you so much for your time today. It was a real pleasure to be here. I look forward to seeing all of your great things that you put out into the world, and hopefully they all have a lot more visual element to them as a result. Thank you very much.